Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Garrity.
And welcome, everyone, to the Tuesday edition, the Election Day edition of the Three Martini Lunch, along with Jim Garrity of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have, what do we have? Good, crazy, and bad martinis for conservatives today, as well as our midterm results predictions at the end of today's podcast. So make sure you stay tuned for that. Jim, yesterday we were not very happy looking at the final polls, and several of them are still much closer than we'd like them to be. But the final polls are looking a little bit better. And basically, many of them, when you have multiple organizations polling the same race, are coming up with different results, which tells us they're really close, so your votes could actually matter. Let's take a quick look at some of them. For example, in Montana, one poll has John Tester up 6. Another one has Matt Rosendale only down 1. Tester 50, Rosendale 49. Clearly within the margin of error there. In Michigan, we'll be talking about this race a little bit later. According to Mitchell Research, John James is within 3 points now of Debbie Stabenow, 49-46. And I believe there's another poll out there that's kind of a new organization, so I don't know how much stock you want to put in it, that it's down to 2 and that James is actually ahead among independents. In Arizona, 4 new polls on that Senate race. Martha McSally leading in 3 of them, but all of them within the margin of error. Kirsten Sinema up 1 in one of those. Even Rick Scott has the 2-point lead in one of the Senate polls in Florida, although Bill Nelson has the lead in 4 others. So Dean Heller up 1 in one poll in Nevada, Jackie Rosen up 4 in a different one. So basically the bottom line here is that you need to get out there, and you need to get out there because Republicans have a really good chance of winning some really, really important races.
You know, Greg, it is every bit as rainy and gloomy as it was yesterday. This means, obviously, we can count on some candidates blaming the rain for their loss later today in some of these tough congressional races here in Virginia. I'm sure they all basically believe, Greg, that their campaign is a crusade, that their voters are fired up, that they've rekindled the American dream in the hearts of tens of thousands of people in this district. But come on, we couldn't expect them to vote in the rain. Too much to ask. You know, it's cold out there. Anyway, I feel a little bit better today with these numbers. These are kind of where I expected these races to be in the final 2 weeks or so. And maybe this reflects mail bomber, synagogue shooter, and various other outside factors. But yeah, you would expect Matt Rosendale to really be giving John Tester the race of his life. And up until recently, he hasn't. He's seen a little bit of tightening. John James is another one of those really good candidates. And even if, Michigan is a state that's blue turning kind of purple, Stabenow has always overperformed the polls. Republicans have always had a tough time against her. But John James is just those grade A candidates, and you expect your grade A candidates who's good on the stump, impressive resume. Everybody who meets and listens to this guy gets really excited. I guess a good way of describing him, Greg, is that he's like the hype of Beto O'Rourke, but with substance behind it, which is, I know, kind of hard to picture and hard to imagine there. A lot of Republicans saying, hey, where are all these national profiles of John James? Oh, he's a Republican. Oh, we can't do that. Okay. If John James manages to pull it off, great. What I think is more likely is that John James will make it much closer than Debbie Stabenow has had in recent cycles. The other Democratic senator is up in 2020, and my suspicion is you'll hear a lot of people saying, hey, John James, if you came within 3-4 points in this cycle, a pretty lousy cycle for Republicans, maybe next time around with presidential turnout and Trump on the ballot and Trump having won the state, maybe you have better time next time out. And so I think you'll see a lot of John James fans coming together. Similarly, Rick Scott, all year long. In fact, for a good shot, one of the reasons I was so down yesterday was that, Rick Scott had been leading this race pretty consistently in the summer and early fall. Bill Nelson seemed to surge ahead, and it's the exact same Bill Nelson we had, 2 months ago, 3 months ago, 4 months ago. Not quite sure what was going on there. So if Scott pulls it off, I think that's pretty likely. I think most people would observe Rick Scott probably has a better shot in that Senate race than Ron DeSantis has in the governor's race. Potentially really disappointing there. But hey, you know what? There are a bunch of these states where you have a governor's race and a Senate race. And a lot of these key Senate races are ones where the Republicans are expected to win the governor's race by a pretty wide margin. Greg Abbott in Texas, nobody's worried about him. He's going to win by, 15, 20 points. The Republicans are expected to win the Tennessee governor's race by a wide margin. Arizona, Doug Ducey's probably going to be just fine. So, yeah, Republicans win all 3 of those Senate seats. Their chances of expanding on their majority in the Senate are pretty darn good. So if you haven't voted, go out there and vote. Don't let Greg or I discourage you. Even if you feel like you're not really thrilled about the candidates in front of you, Greg, there's always some idiot out there who's going to vote for the guy you really can't stand. So go out there and cancel out that guy's vote.
Absolutely. I would have crawled through the mud today to vote for John James if he had been on the ballot. In Virginia, we had Corey Stewart as the Republican nominee in Virginia. Way to go.
Who's not John James.
He's not John James, and he's not going to win, and I'm not going to feel bad for him at all. He's just a disaster. But Tim Kaine, 6 more years of that is a disaster, too. So, all right, let's move on to John James and the crazy martini now, and it's not about him. Folks are trying to get some interviews with John James, some of them actually after the election, including now former Huron Daily Tribune reporter Brenda Battle. Brenda Battle's got some issues, which we'll talk about after you hear the voicemail she left for the John James campaign. Here we go.
Hi, my name is Brenda Battle. I am a reporter with the Huron Daily Tribune in Bad Axe, Michigan, looking to set up an appointment with Mr. James for some time on Wednesday for a phone interview regarding the election results. I'm probably going to send an email over to the info@johnjamesforsenate.com with some details. If you'd like to call me back, my number is 989.
And people kindly redacted her phone number here so she doesn't get harassed or the paper, but it'll come back here in a second.
Thank you. Man, if he beats her, Jesus. John James.
Then she stews a little longer and a little longer.
Whew, that would suck. I don't think it's going to happen, though.
She's like a walking Chris Farley skit here. Jim, this is weird on so many levels. First of all, she doesn't know how to hang up a phone. Secondly, she's clearly unhinged in her political opinions here. And finally, nobody else is talking, so who's she ranting to here? It's just very weird.
Yeah, this ranks as a really, really big own goal here. And the other weird thing, Greg, is, there are times I've had to, request interviews of folks I'm not particularly enamored with, and I hope I've never made it come through in either my writing or my, coverage. I've at least, you can have an opinion and you can still be fair. I'd be very curious to go back and look to see what this woman has written about the race so far. But what I kind of love, Greg, is that she's, in the first initial message, I'm hoping to talk to the candidate after, it's this like sweet old lady. And then it's like, Jekyll and Hyde. The phone doesn't completely hang up. This guy, my God, I'm reminded of Dennis Leary and the Left. I thought mothers were supposed to be sweet and understanding and loving. And, I've seen loan sharks who are more forgiving than you. Your husband ain't dead, lady. He's hiding. That kind of just this nastiness that came out of her in that. Look, we all have hot mic moments or things where we say things, and I hope the right course of action would be for her to apologize to John James. And maybe this is a good teaching moment, right? I mean, the other thing I'd be kind of curious about is so what is it about John James that she finds so absolutely unacceptable? Is it just a standard issue conservative? Well, that's the other great irony is, you can get bad conservatives, and like John James, if nothing else, he's served his country. He served his country with distinction, successful businessman, beautiful family. This is the guy who you want to, we wish we had to vote for here in Virginia, right? This isn't a guy who's attracted controversy. This isn't a guy who's constantly making gaffes or alienating people or something like that. John James is on paper, the kind of candidate that the typical liberal Democrat says that they wish they would nominate, right? None of the scandals, no ethical problems in the background, all that kind of stuff, right? Good old-fashioned, distinguished veteran. Oh, by the way, African-American in a state that's pretty darn diverse. What is it about John James that's so abominable here? I don't know if she'll ever answer it. Maybe she'll just kind of decide to hope this storm blows over. We've all had bad moments and stuff like that, but this is a particularly embarrassing moment. And also, maybe her editor should check on her. Has anybody talked with her lately?
Yeah, her editor did talk to her because she terminated her.
Oh, there you go. Okay. I'd be very curious about what she feels about the whole thing now. My suspicion is that she's going to be radicalized by this. The radical right wing came out to cost her job just because she had she said these things, on the equivalent of a hot mic, et cetera, et cetera. Look, the lesson is, Seinfeld used to have an old routine about how much joy it was when you're angry at somebody on the phone and then you'd slam it down. And now into the era of, it's like, oh yeah, well you can take that and you can go to Hades, slam. And instead now it's like, oh yeah, you can take that and you can go to Hades, and you go, boop. It's not the same effect. And they tell you not to slam down your cell phone. So.
Yes. Oh, man. Yeah, Michigan's my home state. And when you see a matchup like this, Debbie Stabenow's been there for 18 years. She was in the House before that. She ran for governor back in 94 and didn't even win the Democratic nomination. There's nothing original about Debbie Stabenow. Any lockstep Democrat could do what Debbie Stabenow does. There's nothing that she's a particular leader on or anything like that. And John James, like you perfectly laid out, has this fantastic story. This isn't a difficult choice, Michigan. And unfortunately, in the climate right now, it's becoming a more difficult choice in Michigan than it really should be. I mean, the caliber of people and the caliber of candidates in this race really is lopsided in favor of John James. But the polls haven't suggested that so far. But they do seem to be tightening maybe a bit. We'll see if there's a surge for him today. But the fact that it's difficult for good Republicans to get over the finish line in a midterm election, part of it's due to the fact that midterms, as we've said over and over, usually don't go the way of the party of the sitting president. But given the fact that we've got some really good candidates in some of these races, you got him, you got Josh Hawley, Mike Braun, maybe not quite as dynamic as you'd like, but pretty good. McSally, not too bad. We got a fantastic economy. So hopefully Republicans keep and expand their majority in the Senate. Maybe they can stave off losing control of the House. But even though the history says the midterms are not on our side this year, we should still be doing better. Jim, I know that's something that you've been thinking about lately.
Yeah, this is I nominate this for you can say it's our bad martini or our crazy martini. Look, we can argue about President Trump, but I don't think you can dispute that he, along with congressional Republicans, came to Washington and, with a few exceptions, pretty much did what they wanted to do. They would have liked to have completely repealed Obamacare. I think Trump would like to have complete funding for the wall, as I wrote about on National Review a little while back. That you're seeing these modest improvements to the wall here and there. They're not necessarily building Great Wall of China that he pictured, but in places where the Border Patrol wanted to upgrade the wall, make it higher, make it stronger, patch holes, that sort of thing, they're managing to do that. As we mentioned, in almost every other good martini, we talk about how good the economy is doing, not just in terms of the unemployment rate, which is important. I know there's been volatility in the stock market lately, but over the past 2 years, it's still been a nice giant surge. Wage growth is up. GDP is up. I mentioned Obamacare earlier. They got rid of the individual mandate, and this was the part that really drove Republicans crazy. And I think what's most bothersome about this that sweeping reform enacted by Obama. Iran deal is canceled. The Paris Accord is canceled. Obviously, some Republicans don't like the tariffs, but this is the sort of thing that was supposed to help blue collar voters, Democratic union members, white working class. Those folks were pro tariff. Those folks were anti free trade. So far, the evidence is not that they're coming out in super duper droves, particularly in that upper Midwest area, and saying thank you to Republicans. I know there's this mentality of voters are always more driven by fear, always more driven by worry about the future than by saying thank you for what you've accomplished in the past. But Greg, I just, I don't feel, it feels like Republicans should be in better shape than they are. It's a good chance they lose Scott Walker today. Scott Walker, unemployment in Wisconsin is down like 3%, is down to like 3%. The state was in terrible shape when he took over. He enacted the sweeping reforms to public sector unions. He could be out on his keister by the end of the day, or, I guess technically in January. Indiana Senate race isn't locked up. This is a fairly conservative state. Ohio was a state where Republicans thought they had moved it from purple to red. Senate race never really got competitive. And the governor's race, I'm not picking Mike DeWine to win in that one. Pennsylvania never made the Senate race close. Lou Barletta struck me as a good candidate. Maybe the Trumpiest style guy you're going to find in the House GOP caucus. Former mayor of Hazleton, that's in the upper northeast corner of the state, white, working class, blue collar, all that kind of stuff is supposed to work there. I think Republicans will be deeply actually, I guess I'm segueing into my predictions, but I just want to this could be a very disappointing election day for Republicans, and not just they should expand on their Senate majority. The House, they may lose it, but it may not be that bad. But I just have this feeling there'll be a lot of seats they're going to look at as really missed opportunities, not making Ohio or Pennsylvania very disappointing. I think Joe Manchin hangs on. And, he obviously a state, Trump wins by 30-some points, he should be fine. No guarantee on how the Senate and gubernatorial race in Florida are going to turn out, but they're not looking great. I don't think Brian Kemp is a lock. Republicans are telling me not to worry about it, and I guess we'll see how that shakes out. Those two races out in the Southwest, in the Senate. I just get the feeling that, considering the state of the country, the state of the economy, the Islamic State has been smashed. We had mail bomber and synagogue shooter, but it's not like we've had ISIS attacks or Al-Qaeda attacks. Considering the state of the country, Republicans should be in pretty good shape, and they're not. And I really kind of feel like this is a good chance to go back to the drawing board after this. Look, we don't know. We're recording this just a little bit before noon on Election Day. Maybe by tonight there's a whole bunch of Republican victories, and I'm a gloomy Gus, and nobody should worry about this stuff. But if it doesn't turn out to be a great year for Republicans, I think they got to ask some really tough questions of themselves. How is it they enacted their agenda and did what they wanted to do, and by most objective measures put the country in a better shape, and yet the country does not seem to be returning them to office in great numbers? Then again, Greg, I suppose you could always look at the example. Churchill won the war, and then they tossed him out too.
Well, the Democrats have been ready for today since November 9th, 2016. We saw it in Virginia last year. The turnout today in my local precinct was quite a bit higher than it has been in any other midterm. It does remind me a lot of last year, if that's any indication of how fired up folks are around the country. And it's kind of a swing precinct. It's not a lopsided Democratic precinct. And so Republicans need to match that intensity. We've said that in a lot of these special elections and supposedly safe districts that got a lot closer than they probably should have. And we'll see if Kavanaugh and the economy and making sure the Democrats don't get control is enough to get Republicans and right-leaning independents to the polls today. So, all right, let's get specific very quickly. Let's start with the Senate. Where do you see the breakdown? Right now it's 51-49 effectively.
Yeah, I think Republicans pick up 2 seats. That's a pretty good year. I think they probably had hoped. Actually, I'm sorry, wait, let me go back and double check what I had here. I think I may have had them adding 3. Let's see. Keep Texas, Arizona, and Tennessee. Democrats keep New Jersey, Wisconsin, Florida, much to our frustration, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Montana. The GOP flips North Dakota, Missouri, and Indiana. Democrats flip Nevada. Now, I'm hearing some folks say, don't give up on Dean Heller out there. He managed to win his state when Obama was carrying his state by 7 points. But I think that adds up to a 2-seat gain, 53 seats for Republicans, 47 seats for Democrats. A good one that could have been better if they had been able to win. And look, maybe Republicans do better. They knock off Tester in Montana. Rick Scott wins in Florida, something like that. So maybe things get a little bit better. It's a good year in the Senate, not a great year.
Yeah, I'll go. I think I'm going to go +1 here, and I'm iffy at that. I think Nevada and Arizona go blue. I think North Dakota for sure, and probably Missouri go red. And I think Indiana will end up there in the end as well. So 52-48 is my prediction for the Senate. Let's go to the House. Democrats need 23 to win the majority, and we kind of talked about this yesterday. So I know you think they'll barely get there.
Yeah, I had them picking up 25 seats, which is, for Republicans, if you're going to lose the House, losing it by that small a margin might be the most enjoyable, the silver lining outcome, because then you get, first of all, that means that a whole bunch of Democrats who said they were totally never going to vote for Nancy Pelosi will probably end up voting for Nancy Pelosi, because otherwise Democrats will have this big struggle about, if not Pelosi, who? You notice there's really been no House Democrat who's been all that open about their ambitions of replacing Pelosi. The bigger the margins the Democrats have, the more votes you have out there for non-Pelosiites. My suspicion is Pelosi ends up being Speaker one way or the other. I'd really much rather see Pelosi trying to manage a 220-seat majority instead of a 230, 235, something in that range. And I'm on the low end for most prognosticators who are not rightward. A lot of them seeing Democrats having a 10-seat majority, 15, 20-seat. 25-seat as a gain is most years a pretty darn good one. Now, for perspective, in 2010, Republicans won 63. A bunch of bigger ones can happen, but my suspicion is that Democrats end up with a modest majority in the House, and one that's, as much as Republicans are frustrated by this, it gives them a decent shot of winning it back in 2020.
I'm going to be a little more pessimistic when it comes to the House. I went through the likely lean Dem, toss-up, lean GOP, likely GOP from Larry Sabato's site, and came up with a 33-seat pickup for the Democrats. And usually when there's that much of a shift, you get a few more that you don't expect. So I'll say 35 total. I think Virginia is going to be really bad. I think Comstock for sure goes down to Virginia 10, and I got a bad feeling about Dave Brad in 7 and the open seat in Virginia 5. I think the Pennsylvania map shift is going to be very bad for Republicans tonight, and there's a handful of seats in California that are likely to flip. New Jersey's got a couple, and so those are going to lead the way, unfortunately, I think, for Democrats tonight. And hopefully I'm wrong. I definitely hope I'm wrong, but it seems like the districts that are competitive are ones that aren't responding well to the president's closing message and some other things, and the polling suggests that they're tough for the Republicans to hold as well. Finally, and not to end on the sourest of note, Jim, what's going to happen in the governor's races tonight?
Ugh. Yeah, it's bad. Like I said, I think Kemp might hold on. Look, Ron DeSantis could win. I think if he does not, there'll be a lot of good, tough questions about whether he really was the best fit for Florida. Larry Hogan's going to win by a big margin, and I kind of feel like with the lack of success Virginia Republicans have had, it'll be kind of fair to ask, do we need a Larry Hogan type? Larry Hogan, I wrote profile of Larry Hogan earlier this year. He is not a guy who's going to, bring Maryland in a dramatically rightward direction. I described him as his job is like a goalie in hockey or soccer. His job is to stop the bad ones from getting past him. Larry Hogan stops a lot of bad Democratic ideas from being enacted. And given a choice between that or Corey Stewart losing, right now Corey Stewart's at 33% in the Real Clear Politics average. There was a time Virginia was a swing state. Maybe also remind you, Greg, this is up against Tim Kaine. Greg, you may have forgotten this. Tim Kaine was Hillary Clinton's running mate. Right. I say this because Tim Kaine leaves no impression on anyone, no matter how much time they spend watching him, listening to him, or being around him. He is human mashed potatoes. By the end of this conversation, you will have forgotten who I'm talking about. That's Tim Kaine, and Corey Stewart's going to get just shellacked by him this year. And I think it's kind of fair to ask, all right, there's been this argument, no, Virginia Republicans need to get Trump here. No, they don't. This is a red to purple to turning bluish type state, and you need to nominate a guy who's, maybe more moderate, more squishy than you'd like. But the option, this is not all that different from the Mike Castle versus Christine O'Donnell choice, right? Do you want the guy who's going to disappoint you and not vote the way you want all the time but can win? Or do you want to vote for the guy who's perfect but who's going to just get smeared on the side of the road come election day? Looking else around these governorships, the interesting thing is it's just not the races there aren't as many exciting governor's races. I know there's been some talk that Kristi Noem might not win the governor's race out in South Dakota. I think she hangs on. South Dakota is still a pretty darn Republican state. Greg Abbott wins big. Democrats might retake the governor's mansion in Nevada. It's not going to be a great night for Republican governors. And for a long time, that was kind of the bread and butter and what was, building the strength of the party, particularly during the Obama years. Greg, but I kind of wonder maybe this is just a natural reflection of our nationalized, highly partisan era, that when you don't have the White House, your governors have to be the leaders of the party. That because you don't have that one unifying leader in Washington. And that once you have that leader, as the Republicans have with Trump, inevitably the spotlight comes off of your Republican governors and they kind of start, your strength in the state starts to fade a bit as they stop becoming the focus of the energy and the reform ideas and all that stuff in the party. So there's my outlook. It's not a particularly encouraging one. I'd love to be wrong. Greg, I think the best thing I can say to listeners and folks who read me is like, look, I'm not telling you what I want to hear.
That's right.
So it must be what I really think.
We're trying to be honest. That's exactly right. And yeah, it looks bleak. There's going to be Democratic pickups probably in Florida and Michigan and Ohio and Illinois, but let's not shed too many tears for Bruce Rauner. I'd like to say if I could see one Republican winning, maybe it's either Walker or Kim Reynolds in Iowa, but I wouldn't put a lot of money on either one of those. Republicans could very well lose the governorship of Kansas, along with New Mexico and Nevada. So keep an eye on the state legislatures as well. If you get Democratic governors with Republican lawmakers, what they can accomplish is a little more limited. If they drag the majorities of these state legislatures along with them, not only do you get a lot of bad policy, but then your congressional redistricting in a couple of years, assuming things don't shift back in 2020, could get really ugly as well. So a lot to pay attention to on a number of different levels. Jim, let's hope we're right about the Senate and wrong about everything else, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Garrity of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks so much for being with us today. Get out there and vote if you haven't already. And even though you probably won't get a lot of sleep, we certainly won't. Join us again tomorrow for the next 3 Martini Lunch.